It was deep winter in 1941 when a farmer, trudging through the outskirts of Harbin, stumbled upon a silence that didn't belong to the season. The village he approached should have been alive with its usual morning rhythm, the barking of dogs, the clatter of pails, the shouts of children darting between fences. But that day, the air felt hollow, as if life itself had withdrawn. What he found scattered across the frozen ground would follow him until his last breath. Men, women, and children lay where they had fallen, their bodies stiffened in grotesque contortions. None bore bullet wounds or shrapnel tears. Instead, their skin had turned an unnatural black, covered in weeping blisters. Their eyes bulged shut, their faces swollen beyond recognition. Blood trickled from noses and mouths, already crusted in the cold. Some were frozen mid-spasm, their fingers clawed at nothing, their jaws locked in screams that never finished. The farmer dropped to his knees before the nearest corpse, too afraid to touch it, yet unable to look away. He had seen death before, war, famine, plague, but never like this. When he ran back to the town to raise the alarm, he already knew what people would whisper. The demons had returned. But these weren't the old spirits from village tales. The real monsters had uniforms, laboratories, and doctorates. They were Japanese scientists and soldiers, men who called themselves healers and inventors, yet worked under a banner of precision and cruelty that the world would later know as Unit 731. To understand how men sworn to save lives became architects of calculated suffering, we must trace the rise of the nation that birthed them. Japan, once an isolated feudal archipelago, had transformed itself in a single lifetime into a modern empire. Its hunger for conquest masked its destiny. By the dawn of the 20th century, it had already absorbed Korea and Taiwan, wringing resources and obedience from both. But those victories only sharpened its appetite. The generals who now commanded the imperial army believed expansion was not ambition, it was divine right. Their next target was China, a vast land rich with iron, coal, and endless fields that could feed an empire forever. All they needed was a justification to invade. On a chill night in September 1931, Japanese officers crept along their own South Manchurian railway near Mukden, planting explosives that tore a modest hole in the tracks. The damage was trivial, but the narrative that followed was not. Within hours, Tokyo announced that Chinese saboteurs had attacked Japanese property, an outrage that demanded immediate retaliation. The Mukden incident, as newspapers called it, was pure invention, a manufactured spark for a fire that would consume millions. Under that false pretense, Japanese divisions surged across the border and swallowed Manchuria in a matter of weeks. Entire towns were flattened, resistance crushed, and civilians slaughtered by soldiers who had been taught that the Chinese were not human, but pests to be exterminated. Women were dragged from homes and violated before being bayoneted. Infants were tossed into the air and caught on rifle tips for sport. Elders were buried alive, their cries muffled by soil. Smoke rose for months over fields that once fed families. The Japanese army called it pacification. Survivors called it hell. But victory alone didn't satisfy Tokyo's warlords. They envisioned Manchuria not just as a colony, but as a controlled experiment, a frontier where new technologies, new ideologies, and new weapons could be tested, far from Western eyes. In this feverish atmosphere, a man named Shiro Ishii found his stage. Born in 1892 in the small town of Shibayama, Ishii grew up gifted, vain, and utterly convinced that brilliance placed him above morality. At Kyoto Imperial University, he earned his medical degree with honors, charming professors with his intellect, while unsettling classmates with his arrogance. Medicine, to Ishii, was never about mercy. It was power, the ability to command life, to dissect death, to decide who would experience both. The army saw promise in him. They sent him into the field as a medical officer, and within years, he'd become indispensable. His fascination with infectious disease consumed him. While others sought cures, Ishii sought control. He studied bacteria the way a general studies tactics, how they spread, how they killed, how they could be directed. In papers circulated among military elites, he argued that bacteria were the future of warfare, invisible, unstoppable, and terrifyingly efficient. A single tainted well, he explained, could destroy an army more effectively than artillery. Insects carrying plague could depopulate cities faster than bombs. Best of all, disease was cheap, requiring no factories or fleets. only imagination and cruelty. Western treaties banning such weapons, he scoffed, were the weak man's morality. Japan, he said, should transcend such sentimentality. His audacity impressed the generals, who already viewed compassion as an efficiency. By 1932, Ishii had won full support to begin field research into biological warfare, work that demanded isolation, secrecy, and expendable subjects. He found all three in Manchuria. What began as a small team operating from a repurposed prison in Harbin soon expanded into a massive project. Encouraged by results too disturbing to describe in detail, the Japanese government funneled money and manpower into his experiments. In 1936, construction began on what official documents called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Quantum Army. The title was bureaucratic camouflage, the perfect lie to mask the true heart of horror. Beneath its neutral name, Ishii's creation grew into a 6-square-kilometer complex, complete with laboratories, living quarters, airfields, and crematoriums. The locals called it simply the compound, a gray fortress that devoured everyone who entered. Prisoners, Chinese peasants accused of aiding resistance fighters, Koreans caught defying occupation, Mongolian herders who wandered too far, even captured Russian soldiers and Allied airmen were transported there in sealed trucks. They vanished into its gates, erased from existence. Inside, they were stripped not just of clothes and names, but of their identity as human beings. The researchers called them Maruta, logs. It was a cruel joke, a way to speak of corpses before they died. Villages nearby learned to avert their eyes when trucks rumbled past. They saw the black smoke that rose day and night from chimneys and smelled the greasy stench that clung to the wind. Sometimes, after floods, they found what the river refused to keep: bones, fragments of flesh, swollen faces caught in reeds. Parents buried what they found quickly, whispering prayers without words. They called the people inside Oni, demons from old tales that fed on suffering. At night, when the wind shifted, faint screams carried across the plains, long and high like the keening of ghosts. And though no one dared approach, everyone knew something unspeakable was happening behind those concrete walls, and the world had chosen not to see. Behind those sealed concrete walls, the line between science and sadism vanished. The men in white coats told themselves they were researchers, pioneers expanding the empire's understanding of disease. But every experiment they conducted had nothing to do with healing. It was about mastery over suffering. Ishii's obsession was infection, the invisible weapon that could cripple nations. Inside his laboratories, prisoners were deliberately contaminated with plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid. The methods were systematic, almost ritualistic: bacteria-laden food, injections, aerosol sprays, and forced exposure to infected materials. Once symptoms appeared, the subjects were cataloged like specimens. Guards recorded temperatures by the hour, photographed the progression of sores and swelling, documented the time it took for skin to rot and organs to fail. Every tremor, every convulsion was logged with a precision that stripped away humanity and replaced it with data. But for Ishii, mere observation wasn't enough. He wanted to watch disease work from the inside, to witness infection's slow conquest of the body in real time. Victims were strapped to operating tables, conscious, as scalpels split them open from chest to navel. The doctors leaned over, noting how infected tissue discolored, how blood thickened, how hearts struggled against fever. No anesthesia was allowed. They claimed it interfered with results. Some victims begged in Mandarin, Korean, Russian, languages the researchers pretended not to understand. Their cries echoed through the tiled corridors until they ended in the same way: an abrupt silence, followed by the metallic hiss of the incinerators below. A surviving technician, decades later, spoke of those operations with chilling detachment. "We opened them while they were still alive. We needed to see how far the disease had reached. It was important work." That was the justification, the mantra that absolved them all. The experiments grew even more grotesque as the seasons changed. Manchuria's winters plunged to 40 degrees below zero, and the compound became a testing ground for frostbite and hypothermia research. Prisoners were stripped naked and forced into the snow while guards watched from behind glass. When the skin turned white, then gray, then black, the scientists stepped forward. They beat the frozen limbs with sticks to judge whether the flesh had completely solidified. If the sound was hollow, the experiment could proceed. Victims screamed until their throats froze, their breath turning to crystals in the air. Some were thawed by immersing limbs in boiling water. Others held over flames or left to warm slowly in heated rooms. Every method was timed, photographed, and compared. The The purpose wasn't to cure frostbite, it was to understand the threshold between life and death, to measure how long a body could endure agony before it surrendered. Many endured this more than once. When one limb failed, another was selected. Elsewhere in the compound, pressure chambers mimicked the crushing depths of the ocean and the thin air of the upper atmosphere. Men and women were locked inside while dials turned slowly, air whistling as pressure built. Blood burst from noses, ears, and eyes. Some were compressed until their organs ruptured. Others were decompressed so rapidly that their lungs exploded. Observers noted every second of it with academic calm. When the chambers opened, the remains were hauled to the furnaces, fuel for the next round of tests. Still others were sent to gas chambers built to study chemical weapons. Mustard gas, lewisite, phosgene, each released into airtight rooms as doctors watched through reinforced glass. The effects varied. Some victims collapsed immediately, coughing blood. Others clawed their faces until the skin peeled away. The doctors marked exposure times, dosages, and rates of death. When the chamber was vented, guards in protective suits dragged out the bodies, their lungs burned black and skin covered in ulcers. The most efficient compounds were logged for future military use. Yet even this horror was only the beginning of Ishii's ambition. What he wanted was scale, a way to test his biological weapons not on isolated prisoners, but on entire populations. He proposed what he called field trials, arguing that to measure the true efficiency of plague and cholera, one needed living communities. His superiors agreed. Beginning in 1940, Japanese aircraft carrying ceramic bombs designed by Unit 731 took to the skies over China. The payloads contained fleas infected with bubonic plague. Released from low altitude, the bombs shattered on impact, unleashing swarms of insects that spread disease through towns and villages. Within days, entire districts fell ill. Fever, blackened sores, grotesque swellings beneath the arms and neck, signs of plague that no medicine could stop. In one city, over 7,000 died after a single raid. In rural settlements, death spread faster than burial teams could dig graves. There were no explosions, no smoke, just the quiet arrival of death itself, carried on wings too small to see. Other units poisoned wells with cholera bacteria and typhoid cultures, pretending to conduct water inspections. Villagers who drank from those wells were dead within days. Children suffered first, their bodies dehydrating until they looked like wax figures left to melt in the sun. Sometimes, Japanese soldiers delivered food and medicine that had been deliberately infected. Starving refugees thanked them, unaware they were eating death by the handful. The scale of these experiments is still debated by historians, but even conservative estimates suggest tens of thousands perished, perhaps hundreds of thousands when isolated outbreaks are counted. To the doctors of Unit 731, it was all success. Disease had become their weapon, and humanity their testing ground. Ishii's name grew powerful in Tokyo. His reports impressed generals, who saw in him the future of warfare. But for those who lived downstream of his plague zones, he was the devil himself. Fishermen pulled nets filled with bloated corpses. Farmers watched livestock die foaming at the mouth. Parents burned the bodies of their children on pyres made of furniture, too afraid to touch the flesh. Villages vanished without a trace, their streets left to weeds and silence. Even now, old maps of Manchuria mark blank spaces where those towns once stood, erasures written in plague. Inside the compound, the work never slowed. The furnaces glowed night and day, and the air above Harbin shimmered with oily smoke. Those who survived a few weeks longer sometimes glimpsed the sky through barred windows, believing rescue might come. None ever did. Ishii had built a fortress not just of concrete and steel, but of indifference so absolute that morality itself could not enter. By 1945, the empire that had promised eternal dominance was collapsing beneath the weight of its own brutality. Soviet tanks were thundering through Manchuria, and American bombers had reduced Japanese cities to ash. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had dissolved in fire, and Emperor Hirohito was preparing to surrender. Inside the gray labyrinth of Unit 731, panic settled like frost on steel. Shiro Ishii, once untouchable, now faced a new experiment, the erasure of evidence. Every trace of his kingdom of suffering had to vanish before the Allies arrived. On August 14th, a day before Japan's surrender, Ishii gathered his officers and issued orders that turned the compound into a crematorium. Laboratories were drenched in gasoline, their instruments smashed against the floors they'd once defined as sacred. Thousands of files, data that had cost countless lives, were fed to furnaces until the air choked with the smell of burning paper and bone. Buildings were wigged with explosives and leveled in succession, leaving behind scorched skeletons of concrete. The final command was the cruelest: eliminate all remaining prisoners. Guards who had spent years escorting subjects to experiments now turned their rifles inward. Some prisoners were shot where they stood. Others were given injections that stopped their hearts in seconds. Hundreds were locked inside barracks that were then set ablaze, their screams merging with the roar of fire. For 3 days, the killing continued, uninterrupted, mechanical. When it ended, ditches behind the compound overflowed with corpses, hastily covered in lime and soil. The crematoriums belched black smoke without pause. By the time Soviet troops closed in, the site was a graveyard disguised as ruin. Ishii fled south disguised as a common soldier, carrying nothing but a briefcase filled with data. He would reach Japan weeks later, alive and unpunished, yet his destruction was incomplete. Soviet forces captured fragments of the complex before its total annihilation: abandoned operating tables, broken surgical tools, jars that still held what had once been human organs suspended in cloudy liquid. They found cells stained with blood, hooks dangling from ceilings, and records that told a story no amount of fire could fully erase. Among the rubble, they seized Japanese personnel who had been left behind during the evacuation. Interrogations began immediately, and under pressure, the truth poured out. What they described stunned even men who had witnessed Stalingrad. Soviet officers listening to confessions realized they were documenting not just war crimes, but a deliberate, industrialized study of human agony. When the Soviets presented their findings at the 1949 Khabarovsky trials, the testimonies read like dispatches from hell. Former doctors admitted to vivisections without anesthesia, plague bomb tests, and deliberate infections. Guards described nights spent dragging corpses to furnaces. Chinese villagers testified about entire families wiped out by disease, about wells that turned to poison overnight. The world should have trembled, but across the Pacific, another kind of silence was taking shape. In Tokyo, American occupation forces were conducting their own investigation, not for justice, but for advantage. General Douglas MacArthur's intelligence officers, led by Dr. Edwin Hill and Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, interrogated Ishii and his surviving scientists in secret. What they uncovered horrified them as men, but fascinated them as strategists. These Japanese doctors had compiled research that no Western nation could have gathered without triggering outrage. They possessed charts detailing the incubation periods of plague under different temperatures, the resistance of human lungs to chemical exposure, the precise bacterial concentration needed to collapse a city's water supply. It was knowledge distilled from unspeakable cruelty, and for the Americans entering the Cold War against the Soviet Union, such data was priceless. A choice had to be made: justice or information, trials or intelligence. In smoky conference rooms, men weighed human suffering against national security and decided that morality was expendable. Ishii and his entire staff would be granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for their full cooperation and transfer of all research materials to the United States. The deal was sealed under strict secrecy, hidden even from Allied prosecutors preparing for the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. While Nazi doctors swung from gallows for their experiments, Japan's demon physicians walked free, protected by the very power that claimed to stand for truth and law. In the months that followed, crates of documents, preserved samples, and even film reels were quietly shipped to American facilities. The data was cataloged, translated, and locked away under the highest security classification. Officially, Unit 731 ceased to exist. Unofficially, its work lived on. U.S. reports described the material as of inestimable value, evidence too valuable to destroy, too damning to reveal. As the Cold War deepened, biological warfare research in America accelerated, fed by data born of Manchuria's victims. Ishii, meanwhile, reinvented himself. He returned to Japan under a false name, later reclaiming his identity once the scandal cooled. He worked as a consultant for the Japanese government, advising on public health projects, even lecturing occasionally on infectious diseases. He lived comfortably in Tokyo suburbs, growing old, while the ghosts of Harbin remained buried beneath snow and silence. When journalists approached him in later years, asking about Unit 731, he would smile faintly and dismiss the subject as communist lies. He died peacefully in his bed in 1959, never seeing a courtroom, never hearing a verdict. His ashes were scattered in the same land whose soil still held the bones of his victims. Justice, like the smoke that once rose from his furnaces, had drifted away on the wind. When the ashes of war settled, what remained of Unit 731 didn't vanish. It was absorbed, its darkness folded neatly into the world's new order. The American cover-up ensured that the scientists of Harbin would never face the justice their victims deserved. While Europe held its Nuremberg trials and condemned Nazi doctors for crimes against humanity, in Asia, silence became the chosen verdict. Ishii's subordinates went home to reinvent themselves, walking through the streets of Tokyo and Osaka like ghosts wearing human faces. Some returned to academia, their credentials scrubbed clean. Others joined Japan's reborn pharmaceutical and medical industries, trading scalpels used for torture for ones meant to heal. The irony was unbearable. Dr. Masaji Kitano, once Ishii's second-in-command and overseer of live dissections, became the director of Green Cross Corporation, one of Japan's largest pharmaceutical firms. Dr. Ryoichi Naito, who had helped organize plague bombing campaigns, founded the Japan Blood Bank and became a respected businessman. Dr. Yoshimura Hisato, infamous for his frostbite experiments that shattered limbs like porcelain, became a professor at Kyoto Prefecture Medical University. Their students had no idea that their lectures on anatomy were being given by men who had dissected the living. Ishii's protégés wrote research papers, attended conferences, and published in medical journals, their reputations spotless. In the eyes of the world, they were doctors once more. For the survivors, this betrayal was a wound that never healed. Chinese villagers who had watched their families die in plague outbreaks waited for tribunals that never came. Korean civilians who had been used as human test subjects lived in quiet misery, scarred and forgotten. Soviet soldiers who had endured biological experiments were dismissed as propagandists when they tried to testify. Even decades later, official denials persisted. The Japanese government insisted that Unit 731 had been a myth, enemy fabrication, not history. School textbooks skipped over the subject entirely, erasing it from collective memory. Veterans organizations refused to acknowledge what had been done, preferring the comfort of silence to the shame of truth. America, complicit in the cover-up, had no interest in reopening wounds that might reveal its own bargain with evil. The truth lay buried beneath layers of secrecy, classified documents, and political convenience. Meanwhile, the data stolen from the corpses of Manchuria became part of the U.S. biological warfare program, informing research that continued through the Cold War. In laboratories across Fort Detrick and Dugway, scientists pored over Ishii's files, graphs of infection curves, photographs of diseased tissue, notes on airborne pathogens. The results of torture were repurposed as national security assets. Even the methods of containment and field dispersal tested on Chinese villages influenced American prototypes. The moral rot had spread beyond its origin, infecting the very nations that claimed to oppose such horrors. Yet silence, like disease, never stays buried forever. Survivors began to speak, quietly at first, then louder. In the 1980s and 1990s, as Japan's post-war generation grew curious about their country's hidden past, new testimonies surfaced. Elderly villagers from the outskirts of Harbin described seeing trucks filled with captives arriving at the compound each dawn and leaving empty by dusk. They remembered the oily smoke and the strange smell that clung to the wind. Some recalled the day the river thawed and bodies floated downstream, swollen, discolored, their eyes eaten by fish. Others spoke of years when plague returned again and again, spreading faster than the government would admit. The most haunting accounts came from those who had survived the experiments themselves. A Korean woman named Park Young-sim finally broke her silence after half a century. She described how soldiers had forcibly infected her with syphilis to observe its effects. She lived, but only barely, her body left in constant pain, her mind fractured by trauma. They told us it was for medicine, she said, but they were studying how long it would take for us to die. Her voice, trembling yet defiant, pierced through decades of denial. Another survivor, Lee Shawan, had been a child when plague swept his village. He remembered the sound of coughing that never stopped, the sight of his father collapsing in the street, and the stench of burning bodies. Even in old age, he could still hear the buzzing of flies over the mass graves. They said they brought medicine, he told a reporter. They brought death instead. Each testimony peeled away another layer of lies. Former soldiers, burdened by guilt, began confessing. One Japanese medic, named Ken Yuasa, spoke openly about assisting in live dissections and poison gas tests. We were told we were serving the emperor, he said, but deep down, I knew we were committing crimes against humanity. That guilt never left me. His words, stripped of excuses, carried the weight of truth too long silenced. Still, even as voices rose, official acknowledgement remained cautious, calculated. When Japanese authorities finally admitted in the 1990s that biological research had been conducted in Manchuria, they avoided the word experimentation. They spoke of medical studies, wartime necessity, and unverified allegations. Apologies were offered, but never to the victims by name. Compensation was refused on technical grounds. The textbooks were updated only slightly, a few paragraphs buried in appendices, phrased in the language of ambiguity. For those who had lost families to Ishii's plague, such gestures were worse than denial. They were insult dressed as diplomacy. The rooms of the Harbin complex eventually became a museum. Walking through it today is like stepping into the shadow of humanity's darkest reflection. The rooms still smell faintly of rust and formaldehyde. Dissection tables remain bolted to the floor, their metal surfaces cold to the touch. Glass cases hold surgical tools, forceps, and preserved fragments labeled only by numbers. Photographs line the walls, faces of men, women, and children whose lives were consumed in the pursuit of science. Visitors move through in silence, their footsteps echoing where screams once filled the air. Tour guides speak of family members who never returned, of records destroyed but not forgotten. Outside, the wind sweeps across the barren ground where thousands were buried in unmarked pits. Each gust feels like breath from another time, carrying whispers that refuse to die. For those who listen closely, the lesson of Harbin is clear. Progress without conscience is not progress at all. It is annihilation disguised as advancement. Standing inside the preserved ruins of Harbin today, it's impossible not to feel the weight of what was done there. The echoes of a cruelty so methodical that even time seems hesitant to pass. The metal tables, the glass jars, the surgical lights still dangling from rusted ceilings. Each fragment whispers of the people reduced to data, their pain turned into numbers in Shiro Ishii's ledgers. The deeper you walk into those corridors, the more you sense that this wasn't merely a chapter in wartime history. It was the exposure of something elemental in humanity, a fracture in morality itself. What makes Unit 731's story unbearable isn't just the magnitude of death, but the normalcy of those who caused it. These weren't madmen or mythical monsters. They were educated, disciplined men, fathers, professors, physicians, who convinced themselves that cruelty was progress. The photographs of them still exist, men smiling in uniforms, gathered for group portraits, their boots polished, their hands folded neatly behind their backs. They believed they were serving the empire, advancing science, protecting their nation. In truth, they were proving how easily intellect can serve evil when stripped of conscience. That realization lingers longer than any ghost story. It tells us that the capacity for atrocity doesn't dwell in the extraordinary, it hides within the ordinary. And that, perhaps, is what truly terrifies me. For decades after the war, the world refused to confront that truth. Japan rebuilt itself into an economic miracle, cities rising over ashes, while the sins buried in Manchuria remained unspoken. The same government that had denied its existence sent diplomats to negotiate peace and prosperity, while the victims' families faded into poverty, their grief inherited by generations that barely knew the cause. America, too, carried its own quiet guilt. The scientists at Fort Detrick studied Ishii's data in sterile laboratories, far removed from the screams that had created it. They called it strategic intelligence, but each page they read was written in blood. They justified their complicity as necessity, a way to stay ahead of the Soviets. But the truth is simpler. They valued knowledge more than justice. They buried Ishii's crimes so deep that even his victims' names were erased. Justice was traded for data, humanity for power. And perhaps that's why Unit 731 endures in the world's nightmares, because it wasn't just a Japanese crime or an American betrayal. It was a mirror held up to the entire human race. Every nation that learned of those horrors and chose silence became part of the experiment. When I first read the testimonies of survivors, I felt something colder than shock. It was recognition. The same instincts that built those laboratories still live within us. Ambition, obedience, the willingness to rationalize horror if it promises progress. The doctors of Harbin didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as patriots and innovators. They believed suffering was justified if it led to discovery. That's the most dangerous idea ever conceived, the belief that morality can be suspended in pursuit of knowledge. The ruins of Unit 731 stand as proof that science without conscience is indistinguishable from evil. And yet, even now, the world hesitates to face it. Museums gather dust. Textbooks reduce it to a paragraph. Governments still argue over responsibility. But survivors, the few who remain, don't speak of blame. They speak of memory. They speak of the need to be heard before death silences them too. One Chinese man who lost his entire village to plague said it best, "We do not ask for revenge. We ask only that you remember." That is the true verdict left behind by Harbin's ghosts. Not vengeance, not closure, but remembrance. Because forgetting is the soil where such horrors grow again. When I walked the grounds years later, I remember the wind pushing against the trees, a low hum echoing through the empty corridors. It felt less like haunting and more like warning. The walls don't accuse, they remind. They remind us that every civilization believes itself too advanced to repeat the past, right until it does. They remind us that evil rarely arrives wearing horns or bearing fangs. It comes dressed in lab coats, carrying clipboards, quoting statistics. The men of Unit 731 were not born monsters. They became them through rationality, discipline, and loyalty. And if that transformation was possible once, it's possible again. The last of the survivors are dying, their stories fading into history books that too few will read. But as long as the ruins remain, the truth remains with them. A whisper against denial, a warning against forgetting. What began as an experiment in domination ended as a revelation about ourselves. Harbin's soil holds the bones of thousands, but beneath that, it holds something deeper. The memory of how easily humanity can strip itself of mercy when knowledge becomes its god. Every time I revisit the story of Unit 731, I'm struck by one cruel paradox: the way truth can survive even when buried under silence. The survivors who endured the plague zones, the soldiers who couldn't carry their guilt, the villagers who whispered the stories to their children, they became the living archive of what nations tried to erase. Without them, the ruins in Harbin would just be cracked stone and rusted metal. It's their voices that give those walls breath. When they spoke, they weren't seeking pity. They were fighting extinction, the death of memory itself. I once read an interview with a former Japanese medic who had worked in the compound. His name was Ken Yuasa, and he carried his confessions like a sentence he'd chosen for himself. "We told ourselves it was for the emperor," he said, "but the truth is, we did it because we could." Those words cut deeper than any historical record, because behind every atrocity is that same justification: because we could. It's the oldest and most dangerous excuse in history. Yuasa described how he assisted in live dissections, how the men around him stopped seeing the victims as human. He remembered how easy it became to look into the eyes of a dying person and feel nothing. After a while, he said, "You stop hearing their screams. You just hear the data." That sentence stayed with me for days. It explains how an entire generation of educated men could commit acts that defy comprehension. It wasn't madness, it was detachment, the slow erosion of empathy dressed in the language of science. Even after he confessed, Yuasa was treated with suspicion, even hatred. In Japan, people called him a liar, a traitor. They didn't want reminders of the past. But he kept speaking, traveling from schools to universities, telling the same story over and over, because he believed silence was worse than shame. The moment we forget, he said, it begins again. He was right. Denial is a disease of its own, and it spreads quickly when history becomes inconvenient. For decades, textbooks avoided the name Unit 731 altogether. The Japanese government issued half apologies, careful not to disturb diplomatic relations. And America, still bound by its post-war pact, said nothing at all. Only in the late 20th century did journalists and historians begin to unearth the full scope of what had been buried. We called this bad case of life and mother. They found fragments, declassified files, letters, photographs, smuggled out by former soldiers. Each discovery pulled another layer off the lie. It turned out that Ishii's data had been shared not only with the US military, but later circulated among Cold War allies. Some of his methods influenced early studies on germ warfare containment, disease vectors, and vaccine resistance. The world's medical progress, in ways too uncomfortable to measure, carried traces of his crimes. That is perhaps the most haunting legacy, that evil can persist not as a ghost, but as information. We built new laboratories, new weapons, new defenses, all while telling ourselves we were different. But the foundation remained the same: knowledge above conscience. And if there's one lesson Harbin should have taught us, it's that progress without ethics is just refined brutality. The museum that now stands on the side of the old compound doesn't glorify or dramatize. It doesn't need to. The air inside is still heavy. The corridor is narrow and gray. There are jars on display, some still containing remnants of tissue suspended in clouded preservative. There are logbooks with neat handwriting detailing temperatures, durations, symptoms. The handwriting is elegant, almost beautiful, and that beauty makes it unbearable. There's something chilling about realizing that the people who wrote those notes thought they were making history, not horror. Visitors often leave in silence, carrying something intangible, a quiet dread, a recognition that the monsters of Unit 731 were not supernatural, but human in every sense. That's the realization that breaks you, because if they were human, then so are we. And that means what they did isn't beyond us. It's within reach of anyone who abandons empathy in the name of purpose. Every generation promises it won't happen again, and yet history keeps testing that vow. New wars come, new justifications emerge, and somewhere, behind some locked door, someone decides that lives are expendable in the pursuit of knowledge. That's why Harbin's ruins matter. They aren't just memorials to the dead, they're mirrors for the living. As I stood there once, the winter wind cutting across the open yard, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the realization that these lessons, written in blood, are still fragile. Memory fades, documents vanish, survivors die, and when the last voice falls silent, what remains depends on us. The story of Unit 731 isn't just a record of cruelty, it's a test of remembrance. Whether we pass or fail depends on how long we choose to listen. The final truth about Unit 731 is not only written in archives or carved into memorials, it's written in what the world chose to do afterward. Justice never came. Not one of the perpetrators stood before a firing squad or sat in a courtroom to answer for the thousands who died screaming under their scalpels. The United States sealed the evidence. Japan erased it from textbooks, and the rest of the world moved on. That's the real horror, how easily civilization looked away. The ruins in Harbin became relics, curiosities for history tours, when they should have been altars of remembrance. Yet even among the ruins, the story refuses to stay buried. Every year, a few surviving witnesses return, bent with age, walking slowly among the concrete foundations. They leave flowers where the crematorium once stood, whispering the names of people no record ever kept. They speak to the air, to the ghosts that have outlived empires. And though they know no apology will ever come, they keep telling their stories so that silence will never win. Because silence is what allowed it to happen in the first place. What makes Unit 731 terrifying is not just its cruelty, but its logic. These men believed they were serving something greater than themselves. They convinced themselves that morality was weakness, that compassion had no place in science or war. They looked at suffering and saw data. They looked at corpses and saw progress. That's why their legacy matters, because every age in every nation faces that same temptation to justify the inhuman in the name of advancement, security, or survival. The ghosts of Harbin don't just haunt Japan, they haunt us all. They whisper through modern laboratories and military think tanks. Whenever someone says, the ends justify the means. They linger in the unmarked pages of history whenever power demands silence. And they wait for the moment when the world forgets enough for it to happen again. Some call what Ishii and his men did evil, but that word feels too distant, too mythical. The truth is worse. They were ordinary. They woke up, ate breakfast, joked with colleagues, went home at night. They wrote reports in beautiful calligraphy, discussed efficiency over tea, and never doubted their purpose. Evil didn't consume them, it recruited them. It wore the face of discipline and patriotism. It's comforting to think we'd recognize such darkness if it returned, but we wouldn't. It never looks like a monster. It looks like a man doing his job. That's the lesson carved into the stones of Manchuria. The atrocities of Unit 731 didn't emerge from madness. They emerged from order, from hierarchy, from obedience, from men who chose compliance over conscience. And as long as those instincts remain in us, the story isn't over. The Harbin Museum tries to preserve what remains, a warning for the future disguised as a monument to the past. Visitors walk through dim corridors where the walls whisper more than the guides oversay. They see the metal gurneys, the jars, the logbooks. They read the testimonies etched into plaques. And somewhere between those exhibits, they realize the unspoken truth. The greatest monsters in history were never supernatural. They were human beings who forgot how to be human. That is why Unit 731 endures, not just as a historical atrocity, but as a mirror. It reflects back what humanity becomes when ethics are abandoned for ambition. The story's ending offers no redemption, no justice, only warning. Because what happened in Harbin was not an anomaly, it was a revelation. The same potential lies dormant in every system that places ideology above empathy, data above dignity. When I left the site, snow was falling softly, covering the ruins like ash. The wind moved through the broken corridors, and for a moment, it almost sounded like breathing. I remember thinking that maybe the dead were still there, not as ghosts seeking vengeance, but as sentinels, watching to see if the living had learned anything. The doctors are long gone, their laboratories are dust, but the capacity for what they did, that cold, deliberate surrender of morality, still lives in us. The only defense we have is remembrance. To remember what happens when science loses its soul, when war becomes an excuse for cruelty, when nations choose secrecy over justice. The ruins of Unit 731 are more than a memorial, they're a question. How many times must we be warned before we finally listen? The story of Unit 731 isn't just a chapter in history, it's a scar carved into humanity itself. What happened behind those walls reminds us that the darkest horrors are not born in myths or shadows, but in laboratories, offices, and orders followed without question. Remember their names, the victims who never received justice, and the silence that almost buried them. Because every time the world forgets, it begins again. If this story moved you, share it. Keep their memory alive. Subscribe to Dr. Whisper of War for more untold truths buried beneath the noise of history, where the real monsters aren't legends, but people who believed they were right. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop listening to the echoes that history tried to silence.